An archer walks onto the range, nocks an arrow, aims at the target, and shoots. The arrow sails through the air and strikes the bullseye. Was this success due to the archer's ability, or was it due to luck? Our answer will depend on the details. So suppose the shot is so well aimed that in almost any ordinary circumstance, it would hit the bullseye. And in fact, on this occasion, circumstances are perfectly ordinary. Here, we attribute the bullseye to the archer's ability. It's a success that we credit the archer for, and it increases our opinion of him as an archer. Now consider a second archer, who also aims and shoots. Right? Her shot is equally well aimed, and in any ordinary circumstance, it too would hit the bullseye. And indeed, on this occasion, it does hit the bullseye. But there's one important difference this time. This time, as the arrow is on its path, direct path to the bullseye, a sudden and unexpected gust of wind threatens, but fails to blow the arrow off course. Here, even though something threatens to deprive our archer of her success, and she is in some sense lucky that it didn't deprive her of success, she does succeed through ability. This shot also seems like a success, right, that we credit her for, and it increases our opinion of her as an archer. Consider a third archer, who also aims and shoots. This time, the shot is poorly aimed, and in any ordinary circumstance, it would sail wide of the target. But then a sudden gust of wind, of course, blows it back on course, and in this case, we attribute the outcome to just good luck. It's not a success that we readily ascribe to the archer's skill, and it doesn't increase our opinion of him as an archer. Finally, consider a fourth archer, and I promise this is the last archer I'll ask you to consider. This archer also aims well and shoots, such that in any ordinary circumstance, right, her shot would result in a bullseye. But this time, things get really, really weird. As her own skillful shot sails towards the target, it's knocked off course by a sudden and unexpected gust of wind, and then a second gust of wind knocks it back on course straight into the bullseye. Now, is this success of this fourth archer due to luck or to ability? Does this shot increase our opinion of her as an archer, or do we think she's just lucky? It's not exactly clear how to answer this question. But as I said, that's enough with the archers. Sort of having warmed ourselves up with this series of cases involving skill and luck, we're now in a good position, I think, to appreciate the basic idea behind virtue epistemology. And the basic idea here is simply this, that knowledge is just another example of a very familiar sort of thing, namely success through virtuous agency. So just as a credit-worthy bullseye is one that's due to the archer's skill rather than a lucky gust of wind, knowledge is a credit-worthy state of reaching the truth through our cognitive powers of perception, memory, and inference, rather than, say, getting lucky. So on this approach, the virtue theoretic approach, epistemology makes progress by invoking general relations among the notion of agency, virtue, credit, and luck. The hope and expectation here is that reflecting on these general relationships will help us better understand knowledge and indeed, in the long run, other important cognitive states such as understanding and wisdom. So the intuitive notion at the heart of this approach, which actually goes beyond just evaluating cognitive performance, is that of an ability manifesting itself in an outcome, or as it's sometimes put, that of an outcome arising out of an agent's intellectual virtue. Right? An outcome is an agent's doing, an agent's achievement, only when it manifests her relevant abilities, rather than being due to luck. And one of the main selling points of virtue epistemology has been that it applies the same principles to cognitive evaluation and the attribution of knowledge that apply to the evaluation of performances generally, and to the attribution of credit in general, across many domains. So whether we're talking about sports, in which case, say, one's athletic ability manifests itself in a bullseye, whether we're talking about rhetoric, in which case one's oratorical abilities might manifest themselves in the persuasion of one's audience, or we're talking about inquiry, where one's cognitive abilities might manifest themselves in the production of a true belief. Underlying the evaluation in all of these domains is the same basic model, namely that of a person's relevant abilities or attributes manifesting themselves in a successful outcome. So that's the basic idea behind virtue epistemology, is to apply this basic insight, this basic model of performance evaluation to true beliefs and knowledge specifically. So I'd like to say a little bit about the diversity of virtue epistemology before talking about what I think are some interesting recent results that go a long way toward answering one of the main objections to virtue epistemology. And I think these results also in the process speak to just how intuitive and commonsensical the basic approach is. Now, when offering their theories of knowledge, different virtue epistemologists have emphasized different aspects of a person's intellectual character, right? Different sorts of cognitive attributes, as it were, that are most relevant to the production of knowledge. So, for instance, Linda Zagzebski, in her very influential book from the mid-90s, Virtues of the Mind, focuses her attention on intellectual virtues understood as entrenched excellences of persons, right? These are refined character traits such as open-mindedness or intellectual courage, which are acquired through hard work. They're rooted in a distinctive sort of motivation, namely the love of knowledge, or more generally, as Linda sometimes puts it, cognitive contact with reality. Right? People who have these virtues inspire admiration in us when they exercise them. And indeed, on Zagzebski's view, intellectual virtues are just a species of moral virtues. And it turns out that epistemology is a special branch of ethics. Now, taking a slightly different tack, John Greco and Ernest Sosa, two other leading virtue epistemologists, they acknowledge, of course, as they should, the importance and the value of refined intellectual character traits such as open-mindedness, intellectual courage, tenacity, creativity, and so on. But Greco and Sosa focus their attention more on reliable cognitive faculties and abilities that operate on a much lower level than refined character traits such as the ones we were just mentioning. These lower level abilities and faculties don't necessarily inspire admiration in us when they're exercised the way that refined character traits do, and they typically operate independently of any sort of conscious choices that we make or any effort on our part. So examples of virtues of this sort would be, say, very accurate eyesight, highly reliable memory, excellent powers of deduction and inference, and so on. But Sosa and Greco do still insist, however, despite taking this sort of broader, more liberal approach to intellectual virtues, they insist that the relevant abilities or cognitive attributes must be reliable in order to produce knowledge. Now, more recently, in some work that I've done in my project funded by this grant, in my more reflective moments, I've argued that we should cast an even broader net still, that knowledge can issue not only from refined, reliable intellectual character traits and reliable intellectual abilities and powers of the sort that Sosa and Greco talk about, but also from unreliable powers and abilities too. So I think, so on my view, one can even know sometimes by poor eyesight, by unreliable memory, and by forms of inference that don't usually preserve the truth. So that gives you some idea of the diversity of approaches within virtue epistemology when it comes to the relevant attributes that different theorists emphasize when constructing their theory of knowledge. Another in-house dispute within virtue epistemology focuses on what sort of outcome is actually required for knowledge. So the other side of the model now, right? So we've gone from the attributes to the outcomes now. Now, the most common proposal in the literature is that true belief is the relevant state that's required for knowledge, right? But nowadays, more philosophers are warming to the idea that knowledge doesn't actually require, strictly speaking, true beliefs, that all you need are approximately true beliefs. And what determines the level of approximation is perhaps what's at stake, your practical interests, and so on. Even more radical yet, at least from a traditional perspective, evidence has actually been steadily accumulating that knowledge, ordinarily understood, doesn't require belief of any sort, ordinarily understood. So some researchers now suspect that true or perhaps only approximately true representations are the mental state required in order for knowledge to be attained. Now, this is, as I said, pretty radical from a traditional perspective, so you might be wondering who these researchers are. Who say these things, who thinks that knowledge doesn't require belief? Well, lots and lots of people nowadays. So Eric Schwitzgebel and Blake Schultz-Myers, in their very nice recent newspaper, argue that on the ordinary way of understanding knowledge and belief, knowledge does not require belief. Dylan Murray, Justin Sitzma, and Jonathan Livengood, in another nice recent paper, have extended these results and showed that it applies to beings like God and dogs and cash registers. They can know things, but they don't believe things. And me and some of my co-conspirators have also contributed to this line of research. And researchers, all these researchers have found that on the ordinary way of understanding things, people are very willing to attribute knowledge without attributing belief. But they aren't willing to attribute knowledge without any sort of representation taking place. Right? Thus, the motivation for weakening the belief requirement to something like a true representation requirement, whether that counts as a belief or not. But I'm not going to sort of adjudicate that dispute here. The only point I wanted to get across is that there have been in-house disputes within virtue of epistemology on two aspects of the basic model. So what sort of attributes we should focus on when we're constructing our theory of knowledge, and what sort of outcomes are actually required in order for one to achieve knowledge. Now, at the same time that there have been disputes going on both sides of the model, right, everyone has just assumed that the crucial nature of this manifestation relation stuck in the middle is clear enough. But is it really clear enough? Right? Are we actually on the right track with something along these lines? Right? So if virtue epistemology has any hope of delivering a satisfactory theory of knowledge, the answer to this question had better be yes. There better be such a relation as the manifestation relation, and it better be able to do the work that's assigned to it. Right? And it's pretty important because it's the manifestation relation that actually does most of the heavy lifting when it comes to answering the central questions that virtue epistemology is advertised as answering. So for instance, why is knowledge better than mere true belief? Because it's better to get the truth through your abilities than to get it by luck. What is the correct definition of knowledge? Well, it's true belief or a true representation manifesting your cognitive attributes, your cognitive powers, your cognitive virtues. Right? What is the correct theory of inference? So all of these questions get answered by virtue epistemologists by appeal to this crucial relation of manifestation. Right? And as one way of sort of elevating or bolstering the credentials of this crucial manifestation relation, virtue epistemologists have used intuition pumps, right, about non-epistemological cases. And the best known of these sorts of cases involve archers. Right? Thus the series of cases that I began this talk with. Right? There are some cases where the bullseye is credited to the archer's skill, right? And there are the other cases where it's just due to dumb luck. And those cases, of course, are originally Ernest Sosa's. But one worries, of course, whether the intuitions are just going to fall flat. Right? So are these intuitions legitimate? Are we just making this stuff up? Are we posers, right? Just pretenders? After all, philosophers appeal to these intuitions in the cases that are supposedly elicit them in order to bolster their theories. These philosophers are motivated to have intuitions of the relevant sort, or at least to claim they have intuitions of the relevant sort. This is Matthias Steiner, by the way. This was a 435-pound bar at the London 2012 Olympics. And this guy walked away from that unharmed. It's pretty amazing. In any case, to come back to the worry, and to put the worry as starkly as possible, here's the objection, right? That virtue epistemologists appeal to intuitions about manifestation of abilities or the deserving of credit in cases. And these intuitions are obscure, suspicious, self-serving, and unprincipled. All right? So in a nutshell, that's the basic worry. I don't think we're making a mistake when we appeal to intuitions about the manifestation of abilities. I don't think the cases or the intuitions that I have about them are suspicious, obscure, or unprincipled. Rather, I think that virtue epistemologists are merely making explicit in their theory of knowledge something deep and important in our pre-theoretical understanding of the social world. In short, I think that virtue epistemologists are appealing to basic principles from folk psychology, and that the intuitions they claim to have reflect an underlying competence in evaluating agents' performances, and that the burden is on anyone else who says we should jettison this concept, and we shouldn't rely on intuitions about this crucial manifestation relation. And so just quickly, so by folk psychology, all I mean is our ordinary ways, the sort of the suite of abilities that we have in ordinary life for explaining, predicting, and evaluating the behavior of other people. Nothing fancy. Right? Okay. Now, if this crucial manifestation relation and intuitions about it are, as I suggest, principles of folk psychology, right, familiar to us from our ordinary ways of evaluating other agents, then we should actually be able to find evidence of this, right, by using the methods of cognitive science, right? And as it turns out, recent work in social psychology actually lends support to the idea that this is, in fact, a key part of folk psychology. So oftentimes virtue theory has been viewed as like an enemy of social psychology, threatened by social psychology. I think nothing of the sort. Right? I think social psychology, recent work in social psychology actually provides support for the most important aspect of the virtue theoretic research program. So for instance, Bertram Malley and Joshua Knobe published this awesome paper back in 1997 on the folk concept of intentionality. And what they found is that a key part of the folk concept of intentionality, and by that they mean intentionally performing a certain action, right? Not just intending to form the action, but actually intending to bringing it about intentionally, right? So you can try to score the basket, and you can intentionally score the basket. You can try to tie your shoe, and you can intentionally tie your shoe. They mean intentionally performing certain actions, actually accomplishing them. Now, what they found in their research is that intentionality on the folk concept involves not just belief and desire, not just believing that you can do it and wanting to do it, but also ability and skill. And not only that, they found that the ability or the skill must actually enter into the production of the outcome, as they put it, in the right, non-accidental way, in order for the outcome to be judged intentional by ordinary people. So they're actually concerned. One of the cases they actually talk about, although they don't actually test it, I was sort of disappointed that they didn't actually test this case, but they use it to illustrate the basic point. The basic findings of their research involves darts, right? And so they say John intended to hit the triple 20, and he ends up hitting the triple 20, but he does so accidentally because of luck, not because of skill. And in cases like this, where it looks like the outcome is due to luck rather than skill, people are not willing to say that he intentionally hit the triple 20, right? Now, in related work, David Pizarro, Eric Ullman, and Paul Bloom have investigated the role of causal deviance and luck in the attribution of moral blame and praise, right? So what these researchers did was they asked lots and lots of people to consider stories about protagonists who either kill or save people, right? And what they manipulated in their studies was whether the killing or the saving occurs, as they put it, normally or deviantly. Oops, sorry again. Normally or deviantly. And here they actually take inspiration from cases in the philosophy literature, such as this one by Roderick Chisholm. It's adapted from a case back in the early 60s by Roderick Chisholm. Right? So the case goes like this. Joe wants to kill his rich uncle. As he stands to inherit a large sum of money, Joe formulates his plan to murder his uncle and begins the drive over to his uncle's house. Excited at the prospect of soon acquiring a lot of money, Joe is a bit careless at the wheel and hits and kills a pedestrian. This pedestrian turns out to have been his uncle. And when they ask people, did Joe intentionally kill his uncle, in cases like this, people are much less willing to say he did so intentionally, even though they agree that he killed him. But over and over and over and over again, across a number of different cover stories, what Pizarro and the others found was that the luck involved in deviant causation diminishes the extent, significantly, to which we're willing to blame or praise people for certain outcomes. So just say a little bit about this. So right, these are negative cases, right? Cases that involve killing people, right? That's what the x-axis represents. Killing people versus saving people is the positive thing. And then the darker bars represent the normal cases, cases where you intend to do something, you actually do it, and the way in which you do it matches your plan, right? Those are the normal cases. And the lighter bars here, these are the deviant cases, right? And you can see whether it's a negative outcome or a positive outcome, having something happen deviantly, right, bringing it about in the way that you didn't intend it, diminishes the attribution of blame or praise. Now, I think these results lend some support to my hypothesis that at least something in the ballpark of this key notion that virtue epistemologists appeal to, namely the idea of an outcome manifesting an ability rather than being due to luck, is an active principle in folk psychology. This actually affects the way we evaluate people on a day-to-day basis, right? But for virtue epistemologists, I mean, this all might be suggestive. You might think, oh, well, if people are thinking that way about moral responsibility or intentional action, then they're probably thinking that way about knowledge too. It might be suggestive, but it's actually not quite enough. As you might say, look, maybe it works this way for moral stuff, but it doesn't work this way for cognitive or epistemic stuff, right? So the key question is, does it work this way for knowledge attributions too? If it doesn't, then virtue epistemologists are simply getting knowledge wrong, at least if we're talking about about knowledge as it's ordinarily understood. So rather than waiting around for a bunch of psychologists to test whether it does work this way for knowledge too, so I just went ahead and conducted a simple experiment, right, to see if it actually does work this way. So there are 3 conditions in the experiment, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about them right now. And then I'll talk about the results, and then we'll wrap up and we can ask questions. So in this experiment, as I said, there were 3 conditions. One condition features a story of someone who forms a perfectly normal true belief, which is presumably a paradigm case of knowledge, simply the exercise of one's perception and one's memory with no salient luck involved whatsoever. Now, a second condition, also tested, features an agent who forms that same true belief by exercising the same powers of perception and memory. But there's also a salient threat to the truth of her judgment. Now, it so happens that this salient threat to her judgment fails to make it false, right? And in a third condition, right, we read a story about an agent who forms a true belief, but there is a salient and successful threat to the truth of her judgment, such that in the final analysis, the only reason why her judgment is true is due to some deviant or unexpected circumstances. It's a case of what Linda has called in her work double luck, right? There's bad luck canceled out by good luck, and the agent ends up with a true belief nonetheless. Okay. Here are the actual stories, right? So you can judge for yourself. You can have intuitions about these cases too. I'll tell you what most people think in a minute. But here's the normal story. This is just the base case, right? It serves as a kind of control by which we can compare the effect of introducing salient threats to the truth of the judgment and what effect that would have on how people evaluate Emma. So Emma is admiring jewelry in a fancy department store. She's particularly fascinated by the stones in the diamond display. After discussing it with the sales associate, she selects a diamond, pays for it, and puts it in her pocket. After browsing for another minute, Emma leaves the store. I should say, I'm not responsible for any potential sexist overtones of this. I was actually just using an adaptation of a case of a paper published in Cognition, which was relevant to these questions about deviant causation and luck when it comes to knowledge. So in any case, I'm not trying to play on sexist stereotypes here. So that's the normal case. Here's the case that involves a threat to the truth of Emma's judgment. Not an actual, the threat actually doesn't succeed, but it's salient, right? It comes close to succeeding, right? So the threat condition is exactly the same. It starts out exactly the same as the normal condition, except this extra bit is added, right? So we add the second paragraph. And the second paragraph tells us that while Emma was browsing, she didn't notice that a stealthy pickpocket tried to reach into her pocket and steal the diamond she just bought. The pickpocket failed. Afterward, the pickpocket felt very guilty about what he tried to do. So before Emma left the store, he used his smartphone to donate $100 to charity. No one, not even Emma, noticed that he did this. Okay, so that's the second condition. And the reason for this extra stuff down here about feeling guilty and donating to charity, you'll see exactly why that's included in a second. It's actually to control for length and cognitive load when we compare it to the next story. Okay, so that's the threat condition. Here's the deviant condition. It's exactly the same as the threat condition, except this time the pickpocket succeeds in stealing the diamond from Emma's pocket. So presumably when she walks out of the store, there's not going to be a diamond in her pocket. And when she thinks, oh, I have a diamond in my pocket, it's going to be false, and so she won't know. Oh, but wait, the thief feels guilty, and so decides to slip the diamond back into Emma's pocket before she leaves the store. Right? So this is double lock, right? This has a double lock structure. There's a deviant explanation for why Emma's judgment ends up being true. Right? Okay, so we have these three conditions. How are people going to judge Emma in these conditions? Well, of course, we ask people some control questions to make sure they actually understand the story. They have to actually recognize that there is a diamond in Emma's pocket. They have to recognize that it's reasonable for Emma to think that there's a diamond in her pocket. And they have to sort of indicate that they understand why Emma thinks there's a diamond in her pocket, right? So after they pass the control questions, we ask them the test question. Basically, does Emma know, as she's leaving the store, does she know that there's a diamond in her pocket, right? Oops, sorry. Okay, and here's actually what we ended up seeing, right? These are the percentage of people who attributed knowledge in these different conditions. So as you can see in the normal, pretty much everyone says she knows that there's a diamond in her pocket, right? In the threat condition, a very strong majority, pretty much the same, says that Emma knows that there's a diamond in her pocket. And this is actually somewhat surprising, you might think, because that second story is quite a bit longer than the first one. People are just seeing right through that, all that extra detail, right? The stuff about the thief trying and failing and pulling out a smartphone and donating to charity. They just basically treat that as irrelevant, right? She perceived a diamond, she stuck it in her pocket, she remembered that it was in her pocket, so she knows. Nothing weird happened. Weird stuff almost happened, almost made her judgment not true, but it didn't, so people think she knows. In the deviant condition, we see like a huge drop-off in knowledge attribution, right? The presence of these two strokes of luck actually depresses knowledge ascription considerably, right? Okay, so for any of the psychologists here, this is not a statistically significant difference. The normal condition and the threat condition are viewed as exactly the same. Threats, right? When you succeed through ability, even if you almost didn't, even if something threatened to deprive you of your success, you're still viewed as deserving credit for that success. You still know the truth, right? But this difference over here between the condition where the threat is salient and fails, but succeeds in the deviant condition, this is a huge difference, right? So these results suggest that something similar to what's going on in those earlier studies about intentionality ascriptions, the attribution of moral praise and blame, something very similar is going on when we come to knowledge ascriptions, the attribution of knowledge, right? Deciding whether someone deserves credit for the true belief that they formed or whether it was due to just luck. Now, in my own work on this, I actually want to go one step further than what I've just discussed right now. I want to say that, so I've speculated in previous work that the way we view the relationship among ability, luck, and outcomes when it comes to evaluating agents is actually just another example of an even more general way we have of understanding the world that applies not just to people and agents, right, but to objects and systems more generally. So I think it works this way for the evaluation of artifacts, natural kinds, and other things, right? That is, I think our sensitivity to the relationships between ability and outcomes and luck isn't limited, right, to things that are conscious or aware. It's not limited to persons. It's not just a principle of folk psychology. I actually think it's a principle of folk metaphysics, right? I think this notion of an outcome manifesting a power is not just crucial to our understanding and interpretation of other people, but of the world in general. Now, I've done actually some further studies. I'm not going to talk about them here. We can talk about them in question-answer period if you would like. But the basic idea here is these same considerations of causal deviance and luck actually strongly influence people's willingness to use transitive verbs, right? So for example, when there's deviance, it significantly affects whether people are willing to describe one thing as breaking another, one thing as heating another, one thing as trapping another, very low-level kinds of operations that not just humans, but artifacts and natural objects can perform. So as I said, if you're interested in hearing more about that, I can tell you about it in the question and answer period. But in the question of saving some more time for questions, I think I'll just stop there. But before, I'd like to thank the John Templeton Foundation for supporting my research and so much other excellent research in the humanities and sciences. I'd like to thank the Character Project team for doing such a great job for putting all this together. And of course, I'd like to thank you for your time and attention. So thank you. Steve.
Hey, thanks, John. So I'm wondering if these cases are tracking whether an ability is being manifested or whether there's an ability at all. So, and whether our judgments, and maybe in fact you've been doing studies about this, empirical studies, I don't know. So, so there would be the, knowledge is true belief that manifests the ability, but how that would fare just compared to a stripped down version of knowledge is just reliably produced true belief. Forget about the manifestation condition. It's all going to be about whether there's an ability or not. Maybe in that jewelry store case, if you were to ask the respondents, does she have, in these circumstances, does she have an ability to tell whether there's a gem in her pocket? Maybe those people in the deviant condition would say no ability, and that's why there's no knowledge in that case.
Right. So, good questions. Oops, sorry. Yeah, it's all about the elephant. Did I not say? The elephant. We have looked at this, and I can report to you that if you, so take a different version of the jewelry store case, one that might be a little bit more like standard fake barn cases, right? And have it so that when Emma walks in the store, she selects from the tray labeled diamonds, and she picks her favorite one, purchases it, puts it in her pocket, and walks out. And it's a diamond. But it turns out that there's a dishonest clerk that works in the store. And like 99 out of the 100 diamonds on the tray are fakes. They're cubic zirconium, right? Now, in these kinds of cases, here's what we can do to actually get people's knowledge attributions going up and down. Tell people, include in the story, she couldn't tell just by looking or touching it the difference between a diamond and a cubic zirconium. Knowledge attribution sink. Tell people, even though she couldn't tell by looking that it was a diamond rather than a cubic zirconium, she can tell by the way it feels that it's a diamond. Tell them that she has that perceptual ability. Knowledge descriptions look just like the normal case. So it looks like what's mediating, right, some of these judgments, the effective condition on some of these judgments is people's judgment about whether you even have the ability, the relevant perceptual ability to begin with. And I think this is actually exactly what we should want to see if we're virtue epistemologists. That is, implicitly people are saying, oh, you do have the power to detect this by touch or by sight. Oh, and you exercise that power, so yes, you do know. You got it right by exercising that power, and you do know. If they think you lack the relevant ability, they don't think that you know. Right? So this tracks, I think this is actually John Greco's view about fake barn cases. So he says, well, you just don't have the ability to detect the barn in fake barn country, so you don't know. I say, well, of course you do. You see that it's a barn, and so you do know. So he and I disagree about this, but I don't think we disagree on the underlying explanation of why you would have or lack knowledge in these different cases. And that's just readily reflected in ordinary people's judgments about knowledge. This is nothing peculiar about me or John Greco. Which is encouraging, right? Because we're so peculiar in other ways. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering about the exercise here, and in particular the exercise of experimental philosophers chasing philosophical terms of art.
Sorry, when you say exercise, are you talking about the exercise of the virtue?
The exercise with which
the
second part of your paper exemplifies.
So
but never mind what I don't think we need to settle what exercise means. I'll just go ahead with the question. Okay. So I was just at a conference last week where people were wondering if they could experimentally get at whether people are realists or quasi-realists. Okay, I don't have a lot of optimism. So your talk starts saying there's this notion of manifest, right? Important notion in thinking about these things. I think it was at issue in the critical move in the last talk, right? Whether we need a strong requirement for the virtue to be manifested. Okay, seems to me it's a term of a contested philosophical term of art. What's required, a lot of theory goes with it. Now you come along and we find things like people get the difference between a lucky guess, right, and something else. And then so they have certain kinds of facilities in the vicinity, right, of the contested theoretical notion. Does that allow us any confidence in supposing that the folk psychology instantiates something like the philosophical term of art that is contested? I find myself pessimistic. Because I just don't think that a lot of times the folk psychology doesn't come with that kind of grain, right? So go back to the realism, quasi-realism question. I just think it's indeterminate, right? When you get to distinctions that smart philosophers can't understand after reading 10 books, right? And then we're supposed to suppose that folk morality comes down on one side or the other.
Yeah. So maybe you missed this part of like the key move I'm making here. So one objection that I often get when I talk about when I give talks about virtue epistemology, explaining my view, is people will say, so for example, like John Quanvig has said this to me, Jason Baer has played devil's advocate and said this to me, others have said it as well. I've read published criticisms of Linda's work where people, take her to task or attempt to take her to task about this notion of something arising out of a virtue. And we're told it's just obscure. You're just basically making this stuff up. You're saying you have these intuitions about these cases. I think that's an artifact of your theory rather than a reflection of how we ordinarily understand these ideas. So one obvious move to make here would be say, okay, well, let's talk to people who have no theoretical investment whatsoever. Let's present them with cases that display the kind of structure we're interested in and see how it affects their judgment when we go from one sort of case to the other. Now, one other part of what you said, I just wanted to make sure I understood correctly. Did you think this was a lucky guess in this case? That when she buys a diamond, puts it in her pocket?
Whether something is I agree. Lucky guess is one example of where you get something in conformity with the ability that's not a manifestation of the ability. So two kind of complaints. One is Linda's reporting an intuition that nobody else has. In a way, it doesn't really matter, right? What's the matter is the notion. And the second kind of complaint is the notion is obscure, right? It may well be that you can get at something like the typicality or the atypicality of the intuition. I would have thought the real worry was about the obscurity of the notion and how do you persistify the term of art.
If this is how knowledge works, then ordinary people who are perfectly competent with applying the concept of knowledge had better be sensitive to it. That's my view. That's my view. And when you look at the difference between these two conditions, right? This condition here, right, where the blue switches out just to the red, and you see a precipitous drop, like the number of people attributing knowledge, like basically is cut in half. You go from ceiling to chance. Like that tells me we're onto something that's like really active, a principle that's active in the way people ordinarily think about this. Now you might not take any solace in that, but I actually think it's a virtue of a theory that it respects and reflects the way ordinary competent people use the concept. It might not settle all the questions, but it puts us beyond the charge of obscurity, right? Of claiming intuitions out of just convenience or so on. Yeah.
I'm not getting just one last.
I think we should move on. We can talk more after. So yeah, in the back. Yep.
Okay, so this is not the same point as John's making, although it might have some overlap with it. So I just want to make sure it's clear. It's different. I understand you want to show that other people have your intuitions, so you're not biased. I understand that point, that response. So my question is really, what is the relationship between 50% of the, or really 40% of your subjects and folk psychology? Right. So, so there's some people that made this change in their belief, but many didn't.
Oh, sorry.
Most didn't.
That was, sorry, that was between subjects, it wasn't within. So
Right,
no
so
one
we
changed.
don't even know what happens within subjects. So let's
Right.
just assume it was within subjects. But I'll grant you that as a generous move. I'll say that, okay, it's within subjects.
It does hold within subjects.
Okay, good. So you got 50% of the people making no change in their opinion at the bottom. You got another 10%, I say the bottom, top spatially. Another 10% or maybe 20% at the top making no change.
Yep.
So you really only got 30% making a change. My question is, what is the relationship between those 30% and what folk psychology is? And like what people are like?
What is the relationship?
What?
Sorry,
So
I'm not sure what you mean. What is the
It's
relationship?
easy to go from there was a significant, so I'm a psychologist, and we all the time go from there's a significant difference to this is true of everyone.
No.
So, or people,
No.
or folk psychology.
Yeah.
And so my question is, what is the relationship between 30% and folk psychology? You're trying to get at folk psychology.
Yeah.
Does the fact that 30% changed really tell you what folk psychology is, or what people think? That's my question for you.
Yeah, very good question. There's no easy answer to that question. I'll just report to you that there are ways, like what I just did was the barest manipulation possible. There are other, actually pretty subtle manipulations you can do when presenting the exact same material. So for instance, instead of presenting it all at once and then ask a question, you can put the first part of the story on one page, go to the next page, put the second part of the story on that page, ask people, is it true that there's a diamond in her pocket? And then go to the third stage where you reveal that there was a diamond in her pocket all along because the thief put it back or what have you. In that kind of case, where you sort of like dramatize this double luck structure by breaking it up across several pages, knowledge description drops to like 20%, right? You'll get, so here's this is the more complete experiment. Just this good luck, so for example, just in this good luck condition, so I only talked about these three conditions, but down here, like 19%. So yeah, I agree, the move from saying, oh, well look, significantly difference, 80, 50, to something about folk psychology generally, I'm just giving you sort of like some indication of what some of these results have showed, and you can get people basically going from ceiling to floor. And not just
But not ceiling to floor. I think that's important. It's 90 to 12. It's not 100 to 0.
That's not ceiling and floor. Ceiling is when you're statistically insignificantly different from 100%. And floor is when you're significantly no different from 0.
That's
So-
a generalization condition for statistics. That's not really talking about the description of what's going on in the people.
I'm perfectly happy making the conclusion based on these results that this is an active principle of folk psychology and it really does affect the way people evaluate agents. If you're not comfortable, you could like run more studies or wait for me to run more studies before passing judgment. I'll just report that this makes me supremely confident. So, yeah, Linda.
I would just like to point out a feature of your Emma and the store example that is disanalogous with Get Your Cases that I think might help you out.
Good.
In your story, the threat condition, or what I call the bad luck condition, and then the good counteracting good luck condition, operate late in the story.
Yeah.
So that Emma actually does know she has a diamond in her pocket initially,
Yes.
before the pickpocket shows up.
Yes.
And then the quirky stuff happens afterwards.
Mhm.
And then the issue is, does that take away her knowledge as she's, so when she walks out the door, she doesn't really know that she has a diamond anymore.
Yes.
Okay, but in the standard Get Your Cases, the quirky stuff is present at the beginning, right? The bad luck stuff or the threat stuff
Yes.
is operative all along.
Yep.
So it's not like the subject first knew and everybody agrees.
Yep.
And then something bad, some weird stuff happens and then people say he doesn't know anymore. And that, if you designed a case that was closer, I mean, there would have to be something where, I don't know how you would have it, but there would have to be something where she never did know she had a diamond in her pocket. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Oh,
where the
sure.
bad stuff is there right away at the beginning.
Yep.
I wonder if you would get reactions from people that are even lower. That
I've
is,
gotten zero.
even fewer people would say that.
I've run cases like that and gotten 0% over 100 people. I've had 0 people out of 100 ascribe knowledge in that kind of case. This is actually, I think you're absolutely right, and that this kind of case where you sort of fold things in as you go along presents an even stronger or harder test of the virtue theoretic
You want to
apparatus.
have like a gradation, like you
Yeah.
go down the steps.
Yes.
And then, I see.
You walk people through those steps.
Yeah, I see.
If you tell them right from the beginning that, oh, she first bought a diamond and put it in her pocket, and then a thief stole it, and then you say, oh, as it turns out, though, Emma's wearing a coat that long ago belonged to her grandmother, who in hard times stitched a diamond deep in the pocket under a button, and then she died, no one told her about it. Everyone, like, you get between 0 and 10% saying she knows. Like, everyone's just... So this is actually a harder test for the kind of view that I propose. Exactly. You get people sort of on the fence almost. But the case, just in general, is viewed very differently than the threat case, right? The threat case is viewed as a clear example of knowledge, whereas these in-between cases, people are ambivalent. But if you thematize it slightly differently, you can push it down even lower. So I agree completely. You're exactly right.
So we're actually out of time, so
Okay.
maybe you guys can sort of take
Sounds
questions
good.
afterward. Let's thank John for the talk.